Hello, everybody. I'm Kiara Yates. If you've been at the participated in the milestone throughout the course, you know I'm replacing Nicole Soto for this semester on the live webinars. Tonight we're going to go over microeconomics first, ECHO 201, and we're going to go over the requirements of the final project. So during the course, you have worked on the milestones, 3 milestones. And you were required to be proficient. Now for the final, you have to put together those milestones if you haven't already, and you have to go a little bit into more depth with the content to be exemplary. You might already be exemplary for the purpose. You know, your instructor might have already told you that you are exemplary, or you might have to work on some parts. Going over, let's use the rubric this time because the rubric contains the exemplary column where for you to get 100%. So it's a little easier to follow than usually using the sample paper. In the first part, the milestone 1, you had the introduction. So you were going to explain the purpose of your paper and you were going to provide an overview. Oh, I'm breaking up. Can you hear me better now? I'm speaking closer to the microphone. Okay, let me get a little closer. Maybe I wasn't close enough. So as I said, in milestone 1, you introduced your paper and introduced the company, the firm you chose, by providing a history and an overview of your company. To be proficient, you had to outline the purpose of the paper and how it will inform the conclusions of your paper. To be exemplary, you will also have to use industry-specific language. So basically in the introduction, you are pretending to be a consultant for the firm. So if you use more industry-specific language, it shows that you have proficiency, you are an expert in that industry. So if you're discussing Nike, you would use more technical terms to describe the product maybe, or you can use more economic terms to show that you have a good grasp of economics and of the topic. For the history, you would you have to prove that the choice of company is well suited to the analysis. You might have already reached this goal because when you're providing the history and you're explaining what the purpose of your paper is, you might have already achieved the purpose of explaining why this company is suited for the analysis, why you chose it, you know, based on its history. So you'll probably get through the introduction pretty seamlessly. In milestone 2, you had to describe the conditions of the firm, so you analyzed demand and supply trends. You have described trends over a period of 5 years. So if you have not covered a period of 5 years in your milestone, you will want to go back and make sure you cover that time period. And to be exemplary, you also want to make sure that you explain that 5-year trend. Why did the company remain steady? Why there was a growing trend, a declining trend in sales and demand? So you want to be a little bit more specific in explaining it. And then when you analyze the supply side also, you also want to use concrete and well-qualified examples. Providing examples in your paper, in any part of it, will always just give it that extra insight. It will show that you went the extra step, and it will most likely make even the other parts exemplary, because examples will be graphs, will be actual examples of describing why in a particular instance there was a change in trend, why that one time. And you know, if you're specific about your content, you will be exemplary. Moving along, you analyzed price elasticity of demand for your company, and you went over several aspects of price elasticity. First of all, you analyzed it, and justified how you determined the price elasticity of your firm, not necessarily the calculation or the number of it, but how you decided that the product sold or the service provided was price elastic or not. So you illustrate your claims, which means you go a step further. And again, you can use an example like of a specific time period, and you just want to be more specific to be exemplary. And when you go over consumer responsiveness, you want to make sure you went over all 5 determinants of demand and of price elasticity. When you go over the determinant of price elasticity, if you went over just 3 or 4 in your milestone, you probably got a proficient. If you go over all 5 of them, you will be exemplary for the purpose of the final. And the last element of price elasticity was the pricing decisions. And here again, to be exemplary, it asks you to use the research to illustrate your claims. So how did the price elasticity of demand determine the pricing decisions of your firm? If you provide an example, you would be illustrating your claims. So use your research, provide an example, provide a source for that example. It's not an example you made up. It's an example that exists within your firm, within the history of your firm, that shows how they affected, how they changed their pricing strategy, or how at some point they might have increased or decreased their prices, even in consideration of the impact it could have had on the demand. In milestone 3, you had to go over the costs of production. Let me center it. The mouse doesn't work very well. Okay. The cost of production, you analyze the various costs of the firm. If you remember, you analyzed the costs of goods sold and how it impacted the firm's profitability. And then you analyzed variable and fixed costs, and you determine how it informed the output decision. How does the firm make the decisions on where to produce based on the variable and fixed cost? And how is the firm profitable based on the cost of goods sold costs that it has to face? Here again, to be exemplary, you want to again provide example and substantiate your claims. When we ask you to substantiate your claims, it means we ask you to use proper sources to prove, to back them up. You can't just make a claim yourself of you have the data and you're making an assumption yourself. You need to find an example that you found in a source and use that source to substantiate it to be exemplary. And the same way when you do the output decisions, what decisions did the firm made to manage the costs, to manage the variable and the fixed costs? There's example of firms that will change their plants, the location of their plants, to reduce their fixed costs, for example. So that could be an example that you can use in this section to be exemplary for the cost of production output decisions. Again, we're talking about just being more concrete and really providing some examples. You go through the data, you apply what you research, you apply the economic principles that you've studied to draw some conclusions, which is what you do as a consultant, but at the same time, you need to use some examples, some real examples from your research, from your firm, to show that what you have found applies to what you have learned, basically. And that will make it exemplary. It just shows that you really have a good grasp of the economics and you're able to apply it to the research you did of the firm. The overall market, you examine the market share. And in the market share, you provided, I recommended last time that you find a graphical representation of it. It could be a pie that shows the market share of all the companies in your industry, but to provide the data graphically and over time. So if you find information on changes in the market share, if you do that, you will be exemplary. If you provide a graph, most of the times you will be exemplary because you just provide that additional visual aid and then you explain it in your notes. It'll just give that additional insight to your firm. The barriers to entry. To be exemplary, you want to provide an example of a successful or a failed entrant in your industry. So you've examined the barriers to entry, which could be economies of scale. It could be in some industries, it could be just the brand recognition, for example. If you're studying Under Armour, Under Armour is actually a good example of a successful entry. Under Armour is a fairly new company that has not been around for too many years, but it entered the market, and it doesn't have a huge share of the market, but it found its niche and it's doing really well. So Under Armour is a good example. If you're studying, you can use your own company as an example. If you think Tesla, was really at the forefront of electric cars. Other companies tried to start producing electric cars, so you could use the other companies that followed in after Tesla, for example, or to see, how successful were they? Have they successfully penetrated the market? Even if they're established companies that create cars with fuel engine, if they try to penetrate the electric car market and we're not successful, that would be an example of a failure of success. So you can find examples just thinking off the top of your head sometimes, and then you can go research it to substantiate. Kayla, what can mean a good example for Apple? Is that what you're researching? You're researching Apple? That is a little, I'm sure there's a lot of example of mostly failures, likely in the sense that I don't know if there's any company that might have tried to introduce a new operating system, because Apple, Windows, and then the open source ones like Unix are usually the dominant ones. I can't think of an example, but we can look it up once we go over the requirements of the final. Maybe we can talk about it. Some of your colleagues, some of the other students might have some ideas that they can share, because I can't think of a good example for Apple right off the top of my head. The market structure. What type of market structure does your company operate in? And so if you want to be proficient, again, you provide an example to demonstrate the market structure and how the firm can influence it. Just because you're studying that firm, just because it's a famous firm, it doesn't mean that it necessarily has a huge share of the market, and then it can influence it a lot. To have an influence in the market, the firm would have to have a good market share. So that's what you can explain to be exemplary. Maybe your firm can influence it by changing its prices, but maybe not. And it depends on your research. And once you've gone over the main body, you have your recommendations. To be exemplary in your recommendations, the most important thing is to apply economic principles. If you made a recommendation for a firm how to move forward in the future, then what are you basing that recommendation on? You might be basing it on some gut feeling or something or something you read somewhere, but at the end of the day, you also need to try and apply the principles that you've read in Hubbard, your economics principles. So in the second, the recommended action, you want to provide advice for how to strengthen the position in the market. How can your firm grow and acquire more market share? Kayla, that could be something that applies for Apple. Apple has a good market share depending on which field. Apple operates in the smartphones and the computer field. I'm not sure what you have focused on for your product, because when you are looking at price elasticity and market share, you would have had to distinguish between maybe the smartphone industry or the computer industry, the operating system industry, because there's a bit of difference. So how can Apple, if you're studying Apple, maybe how it can strengthen its position, say, for example, in the operating system industry. Windows can be loaded on every computer, pretty much. That is, it can load on Dell, it can load on Acers, it can load on Asus, and any brand like Lenovo, I mean, anything you can think of can load Windows, but it's not the same for Apple. For the Mac OS, to load the Mac OS, you have to go through more, if you can even load it, you know. So you focus on iPhones. So on iPhones, Apple is very competitive. How can it strengthen even more its market position? Is maybe coming up with some, iPhone was the revolution. It's been out for a while, and maybe they need to come up with something even more exceptional, right? So with your research, when you do your research, you can also see what the comments are of people that are experts in the field of the smartphones, and maybe when they criticize some things for the iPhone, that is something that Apple can work on to improve their market position. How can it sustain its success? Again, provide specific ideas. So to be exemplary in the recommendations, you just need to be more specific, and you need to apply the economic principles you've learned. You've made a recommendation, then you can provide an example. And being specific ideas, you can't really go right or wrong when you're giving your ideas, if your idea is based on some sort of research. For example, I had a student once saying that Tesla should start producing trucks. Well, that idea was not so good, because Tesla is already producing trucks. There was an article about it, and it's just not as advertised, and it's not as well known, but it wasn't, it was an idea that already exists. So that wouldn't, validate, wouldn't be a specific idea, because it's not your original idea, I would say. And last is the articulation of response. To be sure you are exemplary, make sure there is no spelling mistakes. So run the spell check and run the grammar check. And pay attention to that grammar check, because sometimes there's words that are spelled correctly, but it's the wrong word. For example, when you say effect and affect, the effect is a noun, the how to affect is a verb, and they're often confused. So when you spell there, over there, and there's compared, belonging to, they're spelled differently. The spell check might not pick them up, but the grammar check will. So run that spell check and grammar check. Make sure that your references are formatted following APA formatting, and that you have cited all your sources. So the list of reference is nothing else but a reflection of all the sources you cited. So if you cited 10 different sources, your references should have 10. Your references should be 10 references, because they need to reflect the citations. That's what the references are there. I go read your paper, you cited your source, and I want to go check it out to make sure, it's a valid source, or maybe I just want to read it out of interest. So I go to the references and I find it. That is why the citations also usually reflect the same formatting as the references, so that you can go find it. If you write the name of the author in your citations, and then when you reference it, you just write the name of the website, I cannot connect the two things, right? I wouldn't be able to relate that citations to the reference, because they have different information in it. So make sure that you are consistent with your citations and your references. There's a citation and references link on the SNU website, I think through the Shapiro Library, and you can actually go on it, put all the information of your source, and they'll generate the reference for you and the citation, and then you can use it. This is all for the final project. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer any. Kayla, one example that comes to mind with the smartphones is, it is the failure, but it's not a new market entry, and it would be like Nokia, how they were not able to keep up with the smartphone trend. But they were already in the cell phone industry. I think they just failed with the smartphone part. But you'd have to look it up a little bit and actually make sure that I'm correct about that. But Nokia used to be really strong and very prominent in the cell phone market until the smartphones came coming up. The other example of success actually is Samsung, because Apple was the first one to produce smartphones and Samsung entered the market, and pretty much they go head to head with Apple. Another example of a smartphones that didn't take off quite probably as prospectors are the window phones. They're out there, but I don't think they have a big market share. You can go check their market share and see how many they sell. I'm all set, Brian. I'm all set and got 100% grade on my last milestone submission. Are there additional prompts and information I still need to add? Brian, when you got your 100%, did you receive feedback from your instructor? Usually when I give 100% to a student, I would specify you're all set for the final, or I would recommend to go review the final rubric to be exemplary so that the student knows if they need to do more work or if you already met the requirements for the exemplary. She just said, thank you, addressing each prompt. Okay, well, do you think now that you're going through the exemplary, column, do you think you have addressed? Have you been specific? Have you provided examples? Have you substantiated with sources? I would, honestly, as I said, usually when I have a proficient student, I specify. I will tell them, no need, you're all set for the final, or I will tell them, review the final rubric to be exemplary. I use these two prompts to kind of give you a hint on which sections you have to work. Yeah, you should, because you might be exemplary, say, in milestone 1 and 3, but need to work on milestone 2, But Bonnie, what have you struggled with? And it's okay to ask. I have students sometimes that ask me additional feedback by email, and I'm happy to provide it because you might have specific questions. I would go through your final and through the exemplary and check it off. And then if you have doubts for a few sections, be specific with your questions, and it's easy. You'll get a more specific answer. So I see some of you are typing, so we can. I'll keep waiting for. You have read the example and watched the videos. Well, see, Bonnie, that's a very generic questions. You have to research your company, use the financial statements that they usually share with their shareholders to find out how their sales went in the last 5 years and apply the principles of demand and supply, price elasticity, and costs of production to the information you find in the financial statements. That's pretty much explained in a nutshell. You might have done better in a class environment. You might have done better with someone explaining to you every chapter of the, going over the book, basically, which would happen in a class. Piece the milestone together after fixing anything he specified, and that's it. Yep. So that's exactly what you had to do, Isaac. You get the feedback you're provided, and the feedback should tell you how to be exemplary or direct you to the rubric to be exemplary where you needed to. And once you fixed it, as I said, if you go over element by element and ask yourself, did I provide an example here where the example is provided? Did I substantiate? Did I use some sources to prove my, to show that this is the price elasticity? Did I use graphs? Every time you can use a graph, I would recommend to use it. because graphs, visual aids help a lot in showing the data so that you don't have to use all these numbers just in the writing, and then you can focus on just a few numbers and the rest of the numbers are in the graphs. That is the best suggestion I can make. Use a lot of graphs. If you look on the textbook, even while you read, there's lots of visual aids. Visual aids help a lot in providing the information. Does anybody have other questions? I know, Bonnie, you've been David's Tea. I don't even know David's Tea, but it must be a publicly shared company if you were able to research it, right? Kayla, you can get more help. Usually your if for struggling students, there's a tutoring service that Southern New Hampshire offers, and you can access your counselor. Your advisor would direct you to it and put you in contact with them, and they can go over the materials with you. Bonnie, you too. They can go over the materials in helping you apply the economic concepts better to your research, and they can also help you with completing your final, your milestones and everything. I usually, if I see students like you, Bonnie, that yes, you should contact them as soon as possible. It's the tutoring service offered by SNU. There should be a link in the classroom too for it, or like but if you email your advisor, they can definitely direct you to it. You can pull the financials from the website, exactly. So David's Tea, does it have the financials on the website, Bonnie? Because that's really most of the research is combing through the website of the company you chose. The majority of the information will be there in the About section. You have the history, the purpose you have to write yourself, and then the financials help you with determining the sales trend for 5 years, how they change their supplies, if they change their products, and their cost of productions are all in the financials. Kayla, maybe you should ask to change counselor. Well, Brian and Bridget, maybe you should share, you know. I always want, I think sometimes working together in terms of even sharing resources can be helpful. I say resources from my students' papers if I find them to be particularly helpful, and maybe it's a hidden resource. Sometimes things pop up on Google that you weren't looking for, and I will save them in case I have a student struggling with their research, and I try to put them in, direct them, put them in the right direction. Samuel Adams shouldn't have been excessively difficult compared to other companies, I must say, although it is still like a smaller market in some ways because it's a specialty beer. The 10K. What is the 10K, Bonnie? Yeah, the graphs, you can just copy them. Usually if you right click on the graphs that you find on the websites, you can save the image and reuse them if they're useful. Yeah, that's true, Brian. You could have, I can imagine that would have been difficult to distinguish between the Boston Beer Company in general and Samuel Adams. That could have been the difference right there. And that's why you submit your preferences to your instructor before you start. And this way you can get some advice on, maybe your instructor could have said you can focus on the beer company as compared to the individual product. Right, exactly. Does anybody have any other questions? Because we can get ready to move on to macroeconomics and their final project. Um, I don't know if you're going to move on to macroeconomics after micro, but for macroeconomics, you're going to research decades. And I would suggest if after the first week you realize that your decade is not quite what you expected it to be and you change your mind, to ask the instructor if you can change your mind after the first week. And this way, make your lives easier. No, Brian, I don't think macro is harder. Honestly, I think it's easier, but I like it better. I think you can apply it better to real world, unless you're a business owner and then micro, would be your daily bread. Um, you can really macro focuses on fiscal and monetary policies. So, and Brian, if you want to stay logged on, we're going to go over the final of macroeconomics. You might get some ideas. But the only difficult thing of macro is that the final is a PowerPoint, not an essay. And I think most students struggle with the format. So, no, there is no math at all, pretty much. Because you really only, there's graphs though of economic trends, but you don't really have to use the math much. You have to find GDP graphs, unemployment, and inflation. But if you want to stay on and listen, that's what I'm going to go over is the final for macroeconomics, and you can get a little bit of a preview. You can even start looking at the videos that I've already uploaded on SNU, which would help, get you kind of a heads up of what you're going into. So, okay. That's fine. I'm going to switch over. Thank you for participating in microeconomics. I'm going to now share the screen for macroeconomics. It is 9:01. Let me see if I get the right document out. So that's not what I wanted. Echo 202. There it is. So I've opened the rubric for macroeconomics. Oh, you're welcome, Kayla. I am Chiara Yates. I'm sitting in for Nicole Soto on the live webinar from macroeconomics. Welcome, everybody. We're going to go over the requirements of the final project for macroeconomics. So far, you've worked on milestone 1, 2, and 3. You've developed your slides and you've developed your content in the speaker notes. And now you just have to go and tweak them to be exemplary. So as we go down, I'm going to scroll down. It's actually some of you might already be exemplary because in some slides, all it is required is to have cited scholarly sources. Hi, Betty. Nice to see you in the class. I hope you're doing good. I remember you're doing the 1980s, right? So to be exemplary for the final milestone 1, the first milestone you focused on macroeconomic data. So you focused on GDP trends, unemployment trends, inflation trends, and interest rate trends. You provided a graph for each of these macroeconomics data. You found that graph on Fred. Usually, that's the easiest place to find it on. And you have discussed those trends in the speaker notes. In particular, you have discussed the GDP trends in relation to growth. So you've also had to figure out what the growth rate for the decade was. And to be exemplary, you want to explain the relevance of the growth rate observed. So this can be a little tricky. Some students get confused and they think, well, what's the difference between examining the relevance of the growth rate observed and providing a nuanced insight into the relationship between events and national output, right? It sounds like it's almost the same thing. Well, it isn't. When you're identifying events, you're identifying historical and current events, which would be maybe a war, natural disaster that have impacted the economy, the terror attack on the Twin Towers, the technology boom, the housing bubble. These are all events that were not that impacted the economy, either helped it grow or helped it, decline. when you're examining or explaining the relevance of the growth rate observed, you can actually use when you see changes in growth, like more growth, less growth, changes in GDP, you can explain them by also using briefly examples of policies or intentional acts of the government to affect the economy. So you can use that. You can just explain that maybe the growth went up and down during the decade, or it was steady during the decade. And you just, you just observe it. Look at the graph. What does the graph tell you? And that is how you explain the relevance. When you go to the events that influence national output, it wants a nuanced insight. So it just doesn't want you to say, well, Hurricane Katrina came, it destroyed New Orleans and part of the Texas coast and everything, and it really impacted the economy in a negative way. Well, we like that, but give more details. How did it impact the economy? Well, what part of the economy was affected the most? The oil prices went up because of the hurricane, for example. And the oil prices went up even now last year when we had Hurricane Irma and the one before it. So you sort of want to make sure that you identify the events, you apply economic principles to explain how these events affected the economy, and you just provide additional insight. That's what a nuanced insight is. It's additional insight. When you move on to unemployment and inflation, for unemployment, if you have analyzed unemployment in relation to changes in GDP, you're already proficient. The only thing you have to do to be exemplary, and this is easy to check and see if you've done it or not, is to explain how the data is collected and calculated. So for the unemployment and even for the inflation, all you need to do is you need to go on the Bureau of Labor Statistics. There is actually you can put unemployment calculation, and it's explained really well how wait a minute, Betty, I'll get to your question in a second. The Bureau of Labor Statistics explains really well how unemployment is calculated and how the data is collected. There is a monthly survey that is done. There's people that call households, a set number of households, and ask them questions about their employment situation. And this is how the data is collected, and then it's calculated. You don't have to calculate the unemployment, you just have to show how it's calculated. So just the little formula that you will find on the textbook. And then you have to go over the events again, and just like you did for the events of the GDP, and use the same events. I mean, by any means, because whichever event affected the GDP and growth also affected unemployment and inflation in some way. And if it didn't affect on inflation, then you can say that and explain why it was not affected. But you use the same events and again, provide a nuanced, so a more specific details to be exemplary in the final. Moving on to interest rates. For the interest rates, you had to explain how changes in interest rates affect other factors of the economy. So when the interest rates go up or go down, how do they affect inflation, unemployment, investments, foreign trade? How are these factors affected? If you've listed the factors listed in the rubric, which are specifically inflation, investment, foreign trade, and the GDP, then you will be proficient. And to be exemplary, you want to list additional factors. So go beyond what the rubric requires. Betty wants to know, can other charts be used for explaining the GDP? You can use other charts if you find them useful, but at the end of the day, the chart goes in the PowerPoint, in the slide, and in the speaker notes, you have to develop the discourse. You have to explain you have to explain the GDP trends and the growth trends. So ideally, you would want two charts, two graphs. One would be the GDP trends. So you would like from Fred a chart that shows the levels of GDP in billions of dollars, year by year for your decade. And then you can go find, always in Fred, the growth rate. So the percentage change year by year. How much did the GDP change year by year? When you have those two, you don't have to do any calculations. You have both trends, and you will see sometimes that just looking at the GDP is not quite as obvious as looking at the growth rates. So yes, you can use other charts to explain the GDP, but you always have to develop the content in the speaker note to explain the chart, if that answers your question. For the final, there's a few extra slides that need to be developed. So please do not forget, absolutely do not forget the extra slides that you have to develop and that you did not work on in the milestones. Because if you don't have those slides and get a 0 on it, you lose a lot of points. Because with the exemplary category, the change, the lost points have more value. You have to develop 2 slides on foreign trade. So first of all, you have to develop a slide, find charts on import and exports for your decade so that you can put it in the slide. And then you analyze the data of the decade. So if you see that imports went up and down, exports changed, analyze that data, provide a little bit of information of what goods and services were traded during your decade. And also just relate those trends to economic outcomes. So why was there a change in import and export during your decade? What was happening in the US, or what was happening outside of the US that affected import and exports? Mostly import and exports are affected because there's a change in the value of the dollar, of the currency. But why was there that change? I mean, the recession is an economic outcome that can affect import and exports. A recession in another country can affect our import and exports. Because if we export to that country and that country cannot afford to purchase our goods anymore, we're not going to be able to export anymore. There's other economic outcomes. For example, now our administration has imposed, just today, they were talking about it at the radio, has limited trade with Turkey. We have reduced the imports from Turkey, and Turkey's economy is already struggling because they've had bad administration for the past years, and in retaliation for that, they are now gonna boycott any U.S. goods, so they're not going to import goods from the U.S. anymore. This might affect us, or it might not. We need to go see what do we export to Turkey. So it might just really not affect us at all, because maybe we don't export anything too important or too much to Turkey, or maybe we do. So that's what you do when you do the import-export slides. Just go look at events that happened during your decade and how they could have impacted import and exports. And then in the second slide, you do the models. So you apply specific models developed throughout the course to demonstrate how domestic and foreign events have impacted the level. So this is more identifying the events, like you did with the GDP, with unemployment and inflation. Identify events that affected foreign trade. Events can be, if you are in the 90s, the end of the Cold War opened up new countries to international trade. For example, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now Germany's back, Eastern Germany's back in the picture. That wasn't available for trading in the 80s or in the 70s. Russia can be traded with more. So what events happen both in the US or outside of the US that could affect our trade, US trade? To be exemplary, you provide a nuanced insight of the relationship between the events. So if you see there's a trend here, when you're discussing the events, make sure they're relevant events and make sure you provide details, and you'll be exemplary. Milestone 2 focused on fiscal policy, and this is really easy, guys. If you are have been proficient for milestone 2, all you have to do is go back, and for the first you have to see if you have cited scholarly research to support the relation between the policies and the issues. So really all you have to do is, when you identify the policies and what their intention was or what their outcomes was, you want to make sure you use a valid scholarly source to support that. That is all you have to do. The policy actions, again, did you have well qualified and cited scholarly research with specific examples and references? It's the same thing, just said in a little bit different words. What you have to do is make sure that your content is substantiated. How do you substantiate your content? Is by including scholarly sources, by using scholarly sources to back it up. And the last part, in the impact, you don't need the scholarly sources to be exemplary, although I always suggest using it, because you have to provide concrete example to substantiate the claims and to comprehensively describe the policy results. So you want to provide an example. If you, for example, are talking of policies that helped unemployment, helped reduce unemployment. An example could be showing how there's been changes in the employment figures from one year to another, using the data as a concrete example. Another example could be a change in habit of consumers. In the 70s, consumers lined up for the gas pumps. That could be an example of a failure of a monetary policy when you do milestone 3. So just provide examples, concrete examples of the decade that you focused on. The exact same things you will do with the monetary policies. With the monetary policies, you will cite scholarly sources to support the relationship between the policies and the issues in the first one. And you will have scholarly sources to provide examples in the second one. So the policy actions, the monetary policy actions. And then in the third one, you will provide examples, concrete examples to show how the monetary policies impacted the economy. Oh, Nick, can you explain a little bit about the ADAS models and how we show that? You can use that when you show the impact. So when there's an expansionary fiscal policy, if you go on your textbook, it'll show you the expansionary fiscal policy, what kind of impact it would have on the economy, right? Usually it would have a multiplying effect, which means you would have GDP growth and you would have the AD curve shifting more towards the right. So that's how you can show it when you use an ADAS model. You can show it in general. You don't have to include numbers. But what you can do is you want to use a model and you want to show how an expansionary fiscal policy would cause economic growth. And what you can do is you can have one graph that has your ADAS curve at the beginning, equilibrium at the beginning of the policy, and then after so many years, after a year or two, if that fiscal policy was successful and there was economic growth, and you can show how shifting AD to the right increases the GDP and increases the price levels. And that will be a use of the model to show what the impact of an expansionary fiscal policy. The opposite you would do if it was a contractionary fiscal policy. So if spending was reduced, then you would show how the curve shifts to the left. Usually the aggregate demand curve would shift to the left. Now, if it's a policy that is aimed at impacting supply, aggregate supply, then you would shift aggregate supply and show how the shift can cause an increase or a decrease in the GDP and a change in the price levels. So you can use has anybody ever looked at the PowerPoints that are available through my Econ Lab? If you go on my Econ Lab and you go on the resources in my Econ Lab, you can choose the module. So you go on the module where you studied aggregate demand and aggregate supply, which I believe is module 2. And you find and select PowerPoints. There's videos, there's several resources there. You select PowerPoint, you open that PowerPoint, and inside that PowerPoint, there's graphs, Nick. There'll be like ADIS graphs, and it'll show you how those graphs change based on the policies. The same thing you can do for fiscal policies. You go to the module where you did milestone 2, and where it explains fiscal policies, and in there it'll show you the changes in the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, as a consequence of the fiscal policy, and you can use those graphs. You can copy them and you can insert them in your PowerPoint, and you make sure to reference Hubbard with it, but you can use them for your PowerPoint, because you don't really need to use the specific numbers to use your model. So you can use the PowerPoints from the Econ Lab that are the PowerPoints Hubbard. Those PowerPoints in the Econ Lab were made by Hubbard to support the book, the textbook. Basically, those PowerPoints are just a review of what you read in the chapters, so you could get a picture from it. You can get a graph out of it and use it and reference it, for example. No, John, I'm talking about the My Econ Lab, where you go do your homework. If you go in My Econ Lab, there's additional resources in there, and you can find the PowerPoints for Hubbard. Hubbard made PowerPoints for each chapter of the textbook. Yeah, Econ Lab. My Econ Lab, the Pearson Lab that you access now through the website, through the classroom now. You can go in there, and it's really, let me see if I can find you an example of, let me open it up and see if I can show you how to, what it looks like. Okay, I'm trying to log into a class because I want to show you where you would go. Let me see. Okay, here. There's Echo 202. If you go in your learning modules and then you go to My Econ Lab, okay, let me share the screen and I'll show you. Okay, share my screen. They don't have their own reference link, John, because they're Hubbard. So you'd have to reference Hubbard. The graphs that are on the PowerPoints are really the same graphs that you would find on the textbook. They're just put in there, so it helps. So this is when you go on My Econ Lab in Brightspace, and you can find, let me find it, Multimedia Library. So you scroll to the bottom, go on the Multimedia Library, which is very slow loading right now for me. Okay, it made it. See, it says all chapters and all sections. So you can click on the chapter you want. You would go, for example, let me see, aggregate expenditure, aggregate demand, aggregate supply analysis. And then see, you have all these boxes you can. So you click on PowerPoint and you do Find Now. And you can go on the Chapter 13 PowerPoint, which opens up here. Now let me see if I can share this with you also. My screen. Let me so if I share the PowerPoint, share my screen. this is what appears. This is a PowerPoint, see? And you can go scroll down, and it does the aggregate demand and aggregate supply analysis, and it'll show you the model. So here you can see the basic model, and as you go down, it will explain to you how the shifts occur and what can cause the shifts. So you can go find the same PowerPoint for the fiscal policies and the monetary policies chapters, and it will show you how they affect aggregate demand and aggregate supply. I'm trying to find. So here's a long run macroeconomic equilibrium. But see, if you go on this graph, for example, it shows you exactly how the shifts occur for the short run supply, aggregate supply, how aggregate demand may change when, for example, firms and households reduce their planned investment, decreasing aggregate demand, workers lose their jobs. So it shows you what happens, for example, during a recession. And it's a really good use to review some things if you're not sure about some of the topics. If you're struggling with some, you can go back and review them a little bit. So I'm going to stop sharing this, and I'll go back to the document. Oh, you're welcome, Nick. That is really useful, those PowerPoints. I usually try to direct my students to go to them right from the beginning of the class, because sometimes you read a lot in the textbook and you struggle a bit with making sense of all the content, and the PowerPoints focus on the most important things. So they're a good tool of review. They're a good tool to use, especially when you have to develop PowerPoints. They're really, really useful. Does anybody have any questions about the requirements to be, the final? Oh, we haven't finished. We've gone through the monetary policies. So the additional 2 more slides you have to add for the final are the conclusions. So you've added the slides on the foreign trade. Those are 2 slides. Now you need to add 2 slides for the conclusion. In 1 slide, you explain the trends and the outcomes. You basically provide a very detailed summary of your decade. It's not a general summary, it's a detailed summary. You will use the slide to highlight the main points of your decade, but then you developed in the speaker notes because you want to kind of summarize it fairly well. And then in the last slide of the conclusion, you want to provide your opinion if you agree or you disagree. To provide that opinion and be exemplary or even just proficient, you have to support that opinion with sources and economic principles or models. Why do you think, if you agree that a fiscal policy worked or a monetary policy worked, why are you saying that? You can say it because you've studied macroeconomics and you know that certain monetary policies worked, and in effect they did work. So use your data, use the research you did to also substantiate your opinion. Defend your opinion. If you were to stand in front of the class and defend your opinion, what you would use all the data you found in the GDP. You would use the outcomes you found when you researched fiscal and monetary policies to defend whether you agree or you disagree with certain policies. Nick, because in the first slide, which the first slide is not even graded basically, because it's just an introductory slide, you might have provided just highlights of events for the decade, while in the conclusion slide, after you've done all your research, you can explain the trends more specifically. So you want to explain those trends and you want to apply those economic models or principles to explain it. Explain what the trends for the decade was. Todd, you had 36 slides on milestone 3. That is a lot of slides. What decade did you research? There isn't a maximum amount of slides, but 36 slides for 1 milestone is way, did you develop speaker notes or did you develop all the content in the slides? That's what I'm Yes, more detail, Nick, and more use of economic theory. You didn't need to use any economic theory in the first slide, Nick. You just had, you just introduced the decade, maybe highlighting the main events or the most notable things for that decade. But in the conclusions, you want to be more specific. Um, I don't know, Todd. That is a lot of slides. I mean, that's more than a slide per year of your decade if you had 36 slides. I'm sure that included the title page and included the references. So 36 slides did not include milestone 1 and milestone 2. It just included um, monetary policies from 67 to 77. There isn't even that many monetary policies really to go over for the 70s because they were um, quite ineffective in controlling inflation and using their monetary policies. So there is not a maximum amount of slides. Did your instructor say anything when they provided you feedback on milestone 3? Yeah, that is a lot of pages for just the monetary policies. I cannot imagine what you wrote in there that would need that many pages for the monetary policies of the 1970s, quite honestly. Because in the 1960s, they did not use a lot of monetary policies. And then in the 70s, they pretty much just changed interest rates. There isn't really, the minimum would be I would say just count the rubric items and have a slide per rubric item. And that would kind of tell you what the minimum is. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. At least 15 to 17 slides, John, I would say, is the minimum for the whole final project. Yes, the templates are very it really depends how much you want to write. Like, for example, when you examine the GDP, you can include both graphs of the GDP and growth in one slide, or you could spread them out in 2 slides and then develop the notes over the 2 slides. So sometimes some students kind of cramp a couple charts in the same slide and then develop lengthy speaker notes under there. Some students like more spacious slides, with bigger charts that are more visible, and so they might spread them out over additional slides, like Todd might have done. Oh, you haven't gotten any feedback yet. That is a lot of slides, Todd. 36 for the milestone 3. But if your content is all relevant, then you know what? I mean, it means you did a lot of work and a lot of research. My fear of doing a lot of slides and like for a milestone and is going over and over, there's more room for making a mistake because obviously you're just taking a macro class. You're not a macroeconomics professor or an analyst or, and so it's more like it, you're more you could kind of go off and go off track a little more, a little more easier if you look into it way over too much beyond the rubric. Does anyone else use it? No, I've never had a student use effects. Only one time I had a student who decided to put the speaker notes in real voice as compared to writing them in the speaker notes. So I had to click on the tab and listen to them, but it doesn't really work that way because the purpose is sort of to have a brief essay or a few paragraphs in each speaker note, and when you're talking you can't cite your sources, so it was straight, I had to and the voice didn't work, so when I clicked on it I couldn't hear anything. Yeah, Todd, I just fear that if you had so much to write, you might have just written what you needed to write and you wrote more, which is not a bad thing, but you know, um, why don't you email your instructor and ask, since you're still waiting for feedback? Not necessarily asking for the feedback, but just even asking and explaining that your PowerPoint was really long and you're wondering if you might find that some of the content of your milestone 3 can be used in other parts of the final to improve other parts of the final. So did you go very long on milestone 2, Todd? Exactly. Yes, John. I mean, if you don't do the talking points in the speaker notes correctly, that impacts the grade a lot. If you do not have speaker notes in your slides, you will not be anything above needs improvement. Even if your slide contains all the information that you think you need, without the speaker notes, you won't get more than a needs improvement. Yes, your milestone 2 was really long. Did you get a good grade on it? If you got a good grade on your milestone 2 and it was also very long, then you're on the right track. I mean, it means, you got it. Yeah. Well, very good then. You might just really be, you did a very in-depth research and good for you if you had 36 slides to fill. Then you shouldn't worry about it. It works. And you probably already covered the exemplary column. Make sure you add the slides on the foreign trade and you add the slides on the conclusions. Those are fundamental for you to get a decent grade because they're worth, 6.4 points each in the overall. And so you lose a lot of points if you don't. They're 6%, so you'd lose 30% of the grade if you miss the conclusions and the foreign trade slides. Does anybody have any other questions? Oh, good. Well, I think we've covered all the requirements. Make sure you cite and you reference your sources and that you apply APA formatting. You can find help with APA formatting through the Shapiro Library. If there's a citation generator. You can go in, put the information, it'll generate the citations and the references. And I wish, if Todd is typing, if you have any questions, I recommend that you ask your instructor. That's what they're there for. They need to answer your questions. Oh, you include a slide for it. Yeah, and that's probably why it came quite long. You didn't really have to do year by year, but you know what? If it worked for you and you were able to explain the policies, then it's fine too. Usually, I mean, the final that we use as the exemplary and as the example for everybody to refer to has about 36 slides in total for the final project. And that is considered a lengthy final, but the student that did it went into a lot of detail in her speaker notes. So when she researched her decade. I think we're good. Yeah, good job, John. That is a really useful resource that, helps a lot. I wish you all a good evening and good luck with your final. This webinar will be uploaded to YouTube. You're welcome, John. Will be uploaded to YouTube by tomorrow morning. So if you want to look at it again with a fresh mind, I understand you guys are all tired or other students need to look at it, they can look at it. There's also YouTubes from the final project webinars of the previous semesters that Nicole held. You could even go in there and look at that. If you just want a different perspective, it always helps. And good luck with your decades. Have fun with macroeconomics.